Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the LaRouche Organization Friday Symposium. I'm Diane Sayre, president of the LaRouche Organization, and will be speaking shortly with Clifford Kiracofe. Some of you heard him last night on the Fireside Chat. So the topic this evening will be slightly different. He is the author of a book called Dark Crusade, the Israel Lobby and Christian Zionism. And there's various other things about his background, which I'll go through shortly. I just, in thinking about this problem, the kind of irrationalism, the kind of wonderment about how you can be in a situation where we're not even supposed to use the word genocide, that there are people who believe that no matter what Israel does, it's legitimate, even though you have many Jewish Americans leading the opposition to what Israel's policy of ethnic cleansing has been. You have this peculiar situation where people make it a matter of religious belief, and you see this in the extent of the hearings on Elise Stefanik, who is supposed to be the ambassador to the United Nations. It's been held up a bit because the governor of New York, trying to protect the Democratic Party's slim minority, trying to make it closer to even in the House of Representatives, doesn't want to appoint or have a special election to replace Stefanik in the Congress. So now Stefanik is delayed from getting into the UN, which is good, but it's not great that she's representing the people of New York, along with certain other people like Claudia Tenney, who just pulled together something called the Friends of Judea and Samaria Caucus. Stefanik said explicitly in her hearings that she believes it is God's will for Israel to take over the West Bank, where 3 million Palestinians happen to be living. And by the way, everyone living in the West Bank is not Muslim. There are a lot of Christians there. Bethlehem is there, where Christ was born, but somehow that is irrelevant. So this is really a kind of kooky ideology, and LaRouche waged several polemics against this, and I just want to get to one. He wrote a paper back in 1995 called "What is God That Man is in His Image?" And in this paper, LaRouche is responding to a group of monks who were very upset with Pope John Paul II, who said that there was a problem with Buddhism because it makes you divorce yourself from the world, that the belief is that the world is an evil place and that you're supposed to have nothing to do with it. And I guess the Pope in his paper said that this is not compatible with the way the universe is created, etc. And then LaRouche makes a polemic which has to do with this, which I'm just going to show you. You'll say why. And hi, Cliff, there you are. So today's New York Post: double murderer loses bid to be spared from firing squad execution in South Carolina. And they go on to say it's the first firing squad in I don't know how many years. And then they describe, here's the setup, and they talk about what it looks like, and the person is strapped in that chair, and they have a target put on his chest, and the 3 volunteer marksmen are placed only 15 feet away from him, and that spectators can watch this through a bulletproof glass window. The whole thing seems so unbelievably barbaric. And the prisoner who was executed this way today tried to get a stay, his lawyer did, because he said he didn't realize that lethal injection might be less painful. And apparently while in prison, he had greatly reformed. When he committed the crime, he was drunk and on cocaine. He beat his ex-girlfriend's parents to death with a baseball bat. But I mean, obviously he was mentally impaired, suffering from mental illness, and in prison had ended up becoming a chaplain for everyone else on death row. He said that the option of lethal injection wasn't properly explained, and he would have preferred that. But the judge just went ahead and said he should be executed. Now I'm going to share with you something that LaRouche wrote in this paper, which this news brought to mind. LaRouche writes, the subsuming issue of that controversy, this is about the Buddhists and the Pope, is the same which confronted us when certain justices of the U.S. Supreme Court argued that evidence of innocence is not sufficient grounds for halting a sentence of death. Have we reached the extreme of moral decadence that the procedures of law are set into opposition to the principle of truthful justice? Similarly, have we reached the point of decadence that one is encouraged to commit his or her passions to support of a certain choice of religious or other belief, but without being so insulting to contrary sentiments as to suggest that one's own belief is grounded in a commitment to truth? So think about that, right? The truth, what does that have to do? What's truth got to do with it? There was a song about what's love got to do with this. What's truth got? Who cares about truth? We have a religious belief. We decided that the man was going to be executed. Who cares if he's guilty or innocent? Who cares? Who cares about Saul converting to Paul? We know justice better than Jesus. And then here, LaRouche says later in this, which is very interesting because he talks about the relationship of religion to statecraft. And he asks, what are the aspects of the religious belief of the citizen whose demonstrable truthfulness has had a positive, even essential impact in shaping the independence, the federal constitution, and the development of the United States? And if you this question of the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, right? We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And then the principles of the Constitution. What's the point of government? The general welfare. Now, you could say that these are, in a sense, particularly the way it's expressed in the Declaration of Independence, religious beliefs. Are they true? And if they are true, that is why you have a right to govern a society based on those principles. And he says this here, getting at that, I think. What's the question of the First Amendment? He said, I argue on behalf of an historically acceptable reading of that amendment that the instant a religious community seeks to impose its opinion on society's practice, right? You can have your own opinion. You can believe whatever you want. But the instant that you decide you're going to impose your opinion on the practice of society, a different positive implication of that equality must come into play. Within each religious community, opinion may be premised upon, quote unquote, blind faith, when the religious community seeks simply to impose such a legally privileged opinion upon the state, blind faith trespasses. In other words, blind faith is not sufficient reason to impose your view and your practice on the state. So I think, let's see here if I can get us back here. Yes, there we go. I think these are really profound questions, and I'm hoping that Cliff, who, as I said, is an author of many things, who was a former senior professional staff member of the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations, who has taught at Washington University, the U.S. Military College, is that right? And you may say, what else? And again, the book is Dark Crusade, the Israel Lobby and Christian Zionism. So, Cliff, why is this relevant, and what is behind these fanatics who are more pro-Israel than many Jewish people and many Israelis?
Well, thanks for inviting me onto the program. And here's the cover of the book. It's available on Amazon. I started, actually, this is a different edition of my original edition, which was published back in 2009. And in that book, what inspired me to write that book was actually the Iraq War, which folks will remember was George W. Bush presidency when he got us into the Iraq War and the Afghan War. And that atmosphere in Washington, D.C., pro-war atmosphere, I was in the middle of it, and speaking out against the war, by the way, back in the fall of 2002. At any rate, the war and the people behind it, the lobbies behind it, attracted my attention because I thought this was a story that really the American people, the public needed to know how different lobby groups, and principally three religious lobby groups. One was the Southern Baptist Convention, another was the Evangelical Association in the United States, and the third was the Conference of Presidents of Jewish Organizations. And these three wrote a letter to President advocating war against Iraq. And so that lobby effort triggered my interest. And when I had been working in the Senate back in the 80s, I was there for 11 years. A woman by the name of Grace Halsell, who had written several books on this topic of Christian Zionism. She was from Texas. She had been a speechwriter for Lyndon Johnson, but she took an interest in this phenomenon of Christian Zionism. She came to see me in my office in the Senate and presented me with two of her books and we had a discussion, and she informed me a little bit about the Christian Zionists. I read her book, and I could see around me in the Senate and in Congress this at that time certain rumblings of Christian Zionism in different offices and so on. Remember back then the context of the 70s when you had a lot of religious fundamentalist organizations getting involved in politics. Jerry Falwell, John Hagee, who is still with us, by the way, and very influential in the Christian Zionist realm. So what I did in the book was I wanted to show the reader that Christian Zionism is a tool of imperialism. That's one thing we need to remember. It's a key theme in my book. And another point that's important is that Christian Zionism as a theology or an eschatology is regarded by the mainstream religions, Christian religions in the world, as a heresy. The Roman Catholics, the Russian Orthodox, the various mainstream churches, the Middle Eastern Christian churches, and so on, regard Christian Zionism, which is a bizarre theology, which I'll explain in a little bit, as a heresy. So how did we get this ideology? Well, Napoleon and his wars in the Eastern Mediterranean and Turkey against Egypt, Napoleon was actually the first to try to inveigle the Jewish communities in that area to support him and his imperialism. They declined. But the British noticed that, and the British, under Lord Palmerston, who was their foreign secretary back in the 1820s, 1830s, picked up the idea that, hey, this Christian Zionist cult that had started in England in the 1820s in this parlor of a banker in the countryside with a few people who got interested in prophecy and futurism, Palmerston realized that there was a political support base there because they advocated return of Jews to the Holy Land and physical return to the Holy Land, Palestine. And Palmerston had a Middle Eastern policy where he wanted to be friendly with Turkey and against Russia. This was part of the great game, the British Empire versus the Russian Empire. And in his desire to be friendly with Turkey, he also got the concept from his son-in-law of, hey, let's advocate Christian Zionism and get some public support here in England, get some of these Christian fundamentalists part of our base.
Can I ask, just for people listening, what is Christian Zionism? What are the beliefs? Because maybe you should
I'm coming to that next.
Yeah, good. Okay.
So I mentioned that in the 1820s, this thing arose in a group of kind of cultic people. And there was this defrocked minister by the name of John Nelson Darby, Darby. And you can look him up on Wiki. And this minister and his little flock in this social circle of rich people had the concept that this is in the area of eschatology, that is to say, the end of the world. And they philosophized, we could say, that they were living in a period of the end of the world. The end of the world was coming. And of course, when the end of the world comes, in their view, Jesus would reappear, and that would be a great thing. And then he would rule for 1,000 years and so on. So basically, it's an eschatology. It's a bizarre idea of the end of time, and they welcome the end of time, and they felt that this would be marked by Armageddon, a giant war in the Middle East. And, the devil would be, stirring it up. And the interesting thing is, in this ideology that they pieced together about the end of the world, they felt that there were several powers that were going to trigger this big war in the Middle East. One of them was the Russian Empire. That was a bad guy. Another was the Persian Empire. They were bad guys, the Muslims. And the third was China. They were the bad guys. So in this end times scenario, the combined forces of Russia and Persia and China would sort of invade the Middle East and create this Armageddon. In the meantime, prior to that, they wanted Jews from all over the world to resettle in Palestine because that would trigger this end times clock. So for them, you had to restore the Jews to this. And this is now I want to make this point. This is what the people in Washington, D.C., the crazies, actually believe. Like you just mentioned, Ms. Tenney here. This is the end times philosophy that these people believe, and therefore they would support Zionism, meaning the return of Jews to Palestine. They would support Zionism, And that's where you get into the phraseology of Judea and Samaria and those sort of biblical code words.
So so they basically wanted to send all of the Jews to Palestine to help trigger a massive war.
Yes.
In which case, then we get the rapture or something comes
That's
at the
right.
end of all of that.
Exactly. We get
Okay.
the rapture. What happens
Wait a minute. I thought only 144,000 get to be saved after that. So what about all these other people who are supporting this?
Well, only 144,000 Jews get to be saved.
Oh, I see. Okay.
But they have to convert to Christianity. Otherwise, they'll be blown up too.
Wow.
And the Christians around the world who believe in this, they will be saved from this Middle Eastern and planetary Armageddon because they will actually ascend into heaven bodily. Now, they're not going to have any clothes on. So they're going to, the scenario is they're going to ascend bodily up into heaven and then be up there. That's the basic idea. That's the rapture. Rapturing upwards into heaven, physically in your body. You kind of float to heaven. And you're saved from all this warfare and craziness of the Armageddon. So that's the eschatology here. Of course, it's insane, but that's what we're dealing with.
But that doesn't stop politicians from promoting it.
Oh, I worked through the 19th century. I worked through World War I. I worked through the interwar period. I worked through the post-World War II period, and I take us through the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, right up to today. Actually, till last July, when Israel was launching some massive attacks on Gaza. And the point here is that politicians who are in power in Washington, a number of them actually believe this stuff. And numerically, these Christian Zionist preachers claim that they have 25 or 30 million Americans believing this stuff. And that gets you into those big churches and the Holy Rollers and all of that, the Southern Baptist Convention. So these preachers claim that there's 10 million, 20 million, 30 million, 40 million Americans that believe this. And, you have to take a look at, it sounds completely bizarre, but the current Secretary of Defense, Mr. Hegseth, is at the extreme end, fringe of these people in his beliefs. He believes in the restoration of the Third Temple. Now those people are so extreme, I didn't even put them in my book. But I guess in a new edition, I'm going to have to add them because of Mr. Hegseth. At any rate, and then you have a couple of others. I think Miss Bondi, over there in the Justice Department. I believe she's another one of these fundamentalist types. So, and there's a whole numerous amount of them in Congress and in the Senate. So,
don't they have? I'm blocking out the name of it, but I remember seeing this Christian or something or other. It's an institute on Capitol Hill. You must know what it's called. I don't know why I can't think of the name of it. But it has to be a recruiting ground for these people. I'm going to look it up while you keep talking.
Yeah, well, there's a number of lobbying groups that get on the Hill and in Washington, and there's one of them, for example, the Family Foundation, and there's several, and they are linked to the Zionist Organization of America, ZOA, which also has a presence in Washington. So that's a linkage between some of these Christian so-called groups linked to the lobby groups like ZOA, Zionist Organization of America, and other pro-Israel so-called organizations. So there's an interface, exactly, that you point out. There's an interface between those two lobbies. And in my book, I start out by saying, look, I'm talking about the Christian side of the Zionist lobby. Other people have written books on the Jewish side of the lobby, but I want to expose the Christian side of this overall pro-Israel lobby.
Good. Now, I sort of interrupted you because I just wanted to give people a sense of what are these Zionist beliefs, but you were back talking about Palmerston. And I have to say this belief dovetails very nicely with some of the British geopolitical objectives, the clash of civilization, controlling the coastlines versus the center, etc. So maybe you could say more about that.
Well, sure. As I mentioned, what Palmerston, as the foreign minister, he had a geopolitical design against the Russian Empire, and in the Middle East, he wanted to be friendly with Turkey. So the idea that he could use Christian fundamentalist, Christian Zionist in England, in the various churches in England, that movement in England, as a political base to support his geopolitics or his imperial policy. So that's the parallel. That's the same thing we have today. Washington, D.C., the politicians are falling in line with the Christian Zionists, and that's supporting an American imperial policy in the Middle East. So that I was trying to draw the parallel between the British use of this crazy ideology to rally a political base and the contemporary American use of this crazy group of people, millions of people, as a political base to project power into the Middle East. I haven't even gotten into World War I or World War II yet, but
please go ahead.
Well, for example, in World War I, the British propaganda, I go into this in the book, the part of the British propaganda to get into, to rally people for World War I, General Allenby was conducting British military operations in the Middle East, and this is World War I, and General Allenby actually, quote unquote, conquered, because they were fighting against, in this case, the Ottoman Empire, because they wanted to grab bits and pieces of the Ottoman Empire, the Arab portions. And General Allenby was fighting, and he conquered Jerusalem. He took Jerusalem militarily. And this was used big time in British war propaganda with the Christian Zionists, because this was interpreted as, oh my goodness, Jerusalem has now returned from the Muslim occupation. It has now returned to the Christians. And therefore, this is a proof of this end times situation. This is a landmark of the end times situation. So the British propaganda, World War I, very carefully manipulated the imagery of General Allenby and marching into Jerusalem and all this kind of stuff. So that's quite important to bear in mind, the staging of all this. And they named him General Allenby, a Lord of Megiddo, which was a word for Armageddon. And so they linked his conquest of Jerusalem and defeat of the Ottoman in that area to this religious ideology. And you can see today in Washington how it's this, kind of crusade ideology. We support Israel. We Christians are supporting Israel and Judea and Samaria against those awful Muslim people. Ooh, how terrible. And so we're going to be the new crusade. That's why I call my book Dark Crusade. We're the new crusaders. And I think if you noticed, Secretary of Defense Hegseth enjoys sort of showing off his body nude, at least from the waist up, and his tattoos. And if you notice, one of his tattoos is a giant Crusader's cross. which is kind of a bizarre thing to have tattooed on you. But nonetheless, aside from that extreme demonstration of sympathy for crusading spirit, you see this, like you mentioned, Congresswoman Tenney and this new group that's for Judea and Samaria, which is a code word, of course, by the Zionists. I would go back and mention that Bibi Netanyahu is a very, very well informed about the United States. I remember when I was in the Senate in the 1980s, in the mid-80s, he was an ambassador of Israel to the United Nations, and frequently he would visit Washington, or people would visit him in New York, and political people. And so he was spreading in the mid-80s this Zionist, revisionist Zionist, the Jabotinsky form of Zionism on the Hill. And that's when you had the beginnings in the late 70s and early 80s, the beginnings of the linkage between the hardcore Christian right, the fundamentalist Christian right, with the Zionist lobby on Capitol Hill. So this phenomenon, political phenomenon, and more recent political phenomenon in the United States goes back to the late 1970s and early 80s, when the Christian right, Christian Zionist right, Jerry Falwell, Hagee, and these people went all over Capitol Hill lobbying on behalf of Israel. And I think that's something that we can see today. That's 40 years ago, please remember.
There's also a lot of money behind that effort.
Well, gee whiz, yeah. The money, of course, comes from the AIPAC, the American Israel Political Action Committee, and numerous other PACs, political action committees, that may have non-Jewish sounding names to them. I mean, you could have, the Evergreen Political Action Committee. Well, that could be all heavy-duty money coming in from New York or whatever, pro-Israel money, but they give the PAC a pleasant little name so that you don't notice it so much in the records. But AIPAC is quite obvious, and they give, I think it was $100 million they bragged about giving in this last election cycle, and they gave money to some 352 congresspersons.
Something like that. And I think they said 98% of the people who they endorsed won their election. Something like that.
Okay. Well, that's a pretty good success, you could say. And so there's a huge amount of money, campaign money. So for a congressperson, you could have a congressperson who's not religious in terms of being, a real obsessed fanatic about Judea and Samaria, but he or she figures, we'll get some good money from the Jewish contributors, so what the heck, we'll just be pro-Israel. So I would regard that as sort of pragmatic politics.
Well, pragmatic politics, but with a real consequence for a few million people on the planet.
Absolutely. And the other group of congresspersons actually believe this stuff. I mean, the right. Real hardcore supporters believe this Christian Zionist ideology, the end times, and we have to support Israel because the end times are coming, and this is what the Bible supposedly tells us what to do. So you have that. And what gets kind of really, really disturbing is we know the genocide that's going on and has gone on for decades in Palestine since the formation of Israel in 1948, of course. And so with the first Nakba or catastrophe, so you've had genocide going on since 1948 in Palestine. And this most recent, I guess you'd say, intensification of the genocide, beginning with the October 7 event, I guess we can call it an event, a tragedy, that triggered then or was a pretext for the Israelis to really launch a genocidal destruction of Gaza. And anyone who follows on the internet, you can certainly see the photographs of the complete. It looks like Dresden. I mean, it's like World War or Hiroshima. The place is just completely leveled. And about, it is estimated potentially a couple 100,000 Gazans were murdered. Men, 60% of which were children and women. So that's a figure. It could be higher than that. It could be 300,000. No one knows at the moment. The 40,000 dead figure is way low. It's about 10 times more than that, most people say. So this does have, just exactly as you put it, this does have a consequence. This bizarre ideology we may think is amusing, or these are, really nutcase people, but the fact is that it has a consequence. There's 300,000 people dead, and we recall in July last year when Bibi visited Congress, everybody was swooning over Bibi in July on his U.S. visit, and then he goes back to Israel and unleashes just an incredible escalation against Gaza. So the American Congress support for Bibi and his revisionist Zionist political ideology, or in the Christian Zionist support for that, enabled Bibi to get away with what he's doing in the U.S. politics. Of course, around the world, the various actions have been taken, the International Court of Justice, et cetera, but it's this Christian Zionist base in Congress that is supporting these atrocities and this genocide. It's really a tragedy for us. And if we take a look at George Washington's farewell address, and I strongly urge people to read it. You can find it online, no problem. Avalon Project at Yale has a good copy of it. But I quote from his farewell address in the introduction of my book, and he talks about a delusional public having a passionate attachment for a foreign power. And there's a whole couple paragraphs on that in George Washington's farewell address. And I think that's very appropriate, a passionate attachment for this foreign entity, foreign power. So we've I think covered a little bit of the waterfront. I can go into some more detail, but I think that's the general outline, the idea that this crazy ideology helped Palmerston and his imperial policy in the Middle East. This crazy ideology is currently all around us every day, helping the Israelis smash Gaza and the West Bank. And now the last 48 hours, we've seen dramatic developments in Syria with the terrorists in Syria murdering Christians and Alawites and other minorities. And the Israelis, of course, support that terrorist regime.
Right. I think this is something that people haven't really considered, why it is that Israel and ISIS, or Netanyahu, I should say, his faction and ISIS seem to be on the same side, on the same team.
Yeah, well, Americans haven't really, the American press hasn't really pointed all this out, but, ISIS was created by the United States, and I can explain that a little bit. In the 19th century, the French and then the British recruited and used certain radical Islamic movements. And the French intelligence service and the British intelligence services manipulated some of these pan-Islamic movements, late 19th century, early 20th century, the Muslim Brotherhood was started in 1928 with the assistance of the British. The idea was to to penetrate or create and manipulate Muslim political movements to the advantage of the imperial power, France or England. After World War II, the British trained up the Americans, CIA, in this technique. And so the British got the Americans' intelligence services involved in supporting the Muslim Brotherhood or being in touch with the Muslim Brotherhood and so on. So that's an example, an early example of U.S. intelligence services copying the British and the French methods of handling political movements in the Islamic world and creating extremist movements also if they needed to. And so that's how ISIS came along. And of course, we remember the famous revelation when Assange and his organization revealed that this fellow Sullivan had sent an email to Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, and Sullivan told her, "Well, don't worry about al-Nusra, ISIS. They're with us. They're on our side." And so this was the Americans thinking that they were being clever and using the British imperial methodology to control and manipulate and penetrate extremist Muslim movements. In this case of Syria, the idea was under Obama, Operation Timber Sycamore, you can wiki that, using these terrorist organizations that we supported to bring down Assad, which after a decade they did. Now, if you take a look at Hamas in Gaza, Hamas is a branch of the old Muslim Brotherhood, which was established in 1928 in Egypt by the British intelligence services. And so Hamas was kind of the only organization in Gaza sort of defending Gazans, and therefore it won an election back in 2008, I think it was, 2006, 2008. But the Israelis, Sharon, supported Hamas strongly. Why? Because Hamas, being Islamic, and Muslim Brotherhood was part of that whole the Muslim Brotherhood linkage to the British and the Americans, and the PLO was secular. So Sharon and the Israelis thought, well, we'll support Hamas, and they can go against the PLO, and we'll just have them fighting against each other. So that's where this Hamas thing kind of comes into play. Again, it's manipulating Islamic organizations.
I think if people really start to pursue the truth of what lies behind these conflicts, like how was ISIS created, how did it grow, where did they get their weapons, that kind of thing, they're going to run into a problem with their beliefs. I mean, if you're a Christian Zionist and you start investigating. Similarly, the Russia-Ukraine war, which I think President Trump is very serious about ending. I found it somewhat jarring that the Israelis seem to have such an affinity with the Ukrainians, and I didn't realize, for example, that Jabotinsky was Ukrainian. And I mean, this same approach, this really vile, the IDF military practices, this clear hatred of humanity, and the same with these neo-Nazi elements in the Azov battalion and in the Ukrainian military forces. It seems to me that if you pursue this, if you're actually pursuing peace, you're going to at some point come up against the contradiction and I'm just wondering when that happens and what it looks like, and can we shatter these crazy beliefs that people are clinging to?
Well, it's a very interesting case. The Azov Nazi type people in Ukraine are friendly with and received weapons from Israel, which is completely bizarre. And also in the early stages of the Ukrainian right-wing, this sort of fascistic movements in the war, they recruited Muslim terrorists from the Middle East. So there were numerous experienced Muslim fighters from the Middle East that came to Ukraine to work with Azov and similar fascist organizations in Ukraine. And interestingly, that's when you also later had then the Russian Chechens loyal to Russia come to help the Russian forces in Donbass, because some of the pro-Nazi Chechens who had come to Ukraine were in Ukraine. So that was going on there. And of course, the United States has a big embassy in Ukraine. The CIA has a huge, station there and all of that. And we knew very well that Ukraine is one of the most corrupt countries in the world, even before this war and anything like that. And we knew very well about these Middle Eastern terrorists coming to help the Azov neo-Nazis. It's just completely bizarre. And but that's where we are. So it was no secret also on the weapons, no secret on the drugs, all that sort of stuff is in the U.S. intelligence purview. State Department knows it. Diplomats know it. McGurk knew it. Those people know this. But yet the idea was, well, we'll use Ukraine to weaken Russia. We'll use them as a proxy to weaken Russia. So again, you have the American imperial warmonger types, military-industrial complex, using extremist organizations, whether they're Muslim or, in the case of Ukraine, of course, post-World War II in the 1950s, the CIA recruited former Nazi Ukrainians to be part of underground, stay-behind underground, to penetrate into Russia and to continue operations in Ukraine. So the use of Ukrainian Nazis, real ones from World War II, was operated through the CIA, and even on their website. I mean, it's unclassified now. Even in their historical section, you could read about, say, CIA operations in Ukraine, using these true former Nazi people as networks for sabotage and other things against the Soviet Union, of which Ukraine was part of the Soviet sphere.
Right.
So this use of the true Nazis from World War II, and then the neo-Nazis who grew out of them in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and all that, that's been part and parcel of U.S. Covert operations, just as ISIS was partly a U.S. covert operation. So you're absolutely correct to point out the parallels between the two, the use of terrorist organizations as imperial policy.
Right. And I think if you pull the thread, what people are going to find is where the roads converge. And then the question is, how can you not support one group of Nazis and support another group of them in some other place on the planet? Maybe it would be better to have a consistent policy of not supporting such activities and try and get mankind to have a little bit more elevated view of itself.
Oh, absolutely. And the problem we've had since the Cold War is the militarization of U.S. foreign policy. Now, Eisenhower, Ike, in his farewell address, warned about the military-industrial complex and all of that. And it's worthwhile to go on to YouTube and find Ike's farewell address and just listen to that section where he talks about the military-industrial complex. He was telling us the truth about it. Of course, Jack Kennedy knew that, and Jack Kennedy was friendly with Eisenhower and all of that. So the problem we've had is a Cold War. We militarized our foreign policy, and we've never stopped. And so we haven't gotten into actual true diplomacy. Now, Nixon tried some diplomacy with Kissinger, more on a geopolitical level, but at least it was some diplomacy and a little bit of détente with Russia and a little bit of détente with China. So there was some revival of diplomacy. However, up until Trump 2, the new Trump administration, we haven't really had much emphasis on diplomacy. And that's one thing where I may have some reservations about our foreign policy or whatever. But one thing I'm very excited about is so far, Trump is actually trying to revive diplomacy. That is to say, he picks up the phone and calls Putin. Well, my goodness, that's fantastic. He sent Witkoff and that other delegation first to sort of open up the diplomatic discussion and contact with Russia. That's great, because you cannot get to peace, for example, in Ukraine, or peace in the Middle East, but you can't get to peace in Ukraine unless we reestablish diplomacy with Russia. And then U.S.-Russian diplomacy, when we get those relations going better now and repair that relationship, then we can take that repaired relationship and apply it to problems of mutual concern, Ukraine or Middle East. So I think Trump intuitively, a businessman, a kind of a wheeler dealer, a businessman, a deal maker, a transactional sort of person, I think he intuitively realizes, well, I'm the chairman of the board here in the United States. I got to talk with the chairman of the board in Russia, and that's Putin. And we got to work stuff out. And so I'm very encouraged that we, for the moment, have a diplomatic, not a process yet, but we have diplomatic contacts going. And Trump knows that if he can better the relationship between us and Russia, that will lead to the possibility of fruitful negotiations on Ukraine. So it's kind of two steps. He's got to repair relations with Russia first, and then when they're repaired enough, then we can work on Ukraine. So in that sense, I quite agree with you that we must shift from militarization of foreign policy, which we can call geopolitics, shift from the militarization of foreign policy toward diplomacy. Let's have negotiations and such.
Right. An actual diplomacy where you actually hear what your counterpart is saying and you hear what their concerns are. Go ahead.
That's a really good point. That's a key point, actually. The key point is real professional diplomacy. You have to have empathy for the other. You have to be able to put yourself in the other person's shoes to try to assess and figure out, okay, that's how the Russians are thinking. All right. And these are their concerns. Okay, I can see that. And all right. And I have mine, and I want them to know my concerns, etc. So there's this absolute necessity on the part of a diplomat for empathy with the other. And that is a diplomatic principle of many, many centuries, the idea of mutual advantage, that it's a win-win in the Chinese phraseology, not win-lose, not I win, you lose. It's we both win, or we both have a mutual advantage, which means you are empathetic with the other person, other side, and you want both sides, yourself and the other side, to have a mutual benefit, right? And that's where I think, or at least where I hope, Trump, with his sort of business negotiating background, has a sense of that. And so we'll see how it plays out. But I think you're absolutely right. We must shift from the geopolitical militarization of policy, foreign policy, toward let's have some good diplomacy. For example, we have a tradition of that. What about good old Benjamin Franklin back in the Revolutionary War era when Franklin was ambassador to France? Or what about some of our other famous diplomats? Monroe,
John Quincy Adams and Russia,
exactly.
right?
John Quincy Adams. John Adams took John Quincy to Russia with him as a young man. And so, and actually, it's good that you mentioned John Quincy Adams, because he's, I guess you could say, a real model for, kind of the classical American diplomat. Definitely John Quincy Adams would be, I guess you could say, one of the best examples of that. And there's actually a very fine book published in 1949 by an American diplomatic historian, Samuel Flagg Bemis, B-E-M-I-S. And it's a biography of John Quincy Adams and his diplomacy. And I have a copy here. I strongly recommend finding it on the used market and taking a look at it. Professor Bemis taught at Yale University, and he was the dean of American diplomatic historians back in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s. I think he died in the 60s. But yes, Bemis, Samuel Flagg Bemis on John Quincy Adams. So that, and of course you had Jefferson and Louisiana Purchase. You had other interesting diplomatic actions under Abraham Lincoln, a very close relationship with Russia. Way back in the Revolution, a close relationship with Catherine the Great, who had the armed neutrality policy that helped us in our revolution. And then Lincoln with Russia, and the Russians sending a fleet to New York and San Francisco during the Civil War to kind of fend off the British, etc. So, and then in the 19th century, late 19th century, the Russian ambassador to the United States was regarded very highly. He was what they call the dean of the diplomatic corps. The Russian ambassador to the United States became the dean of the diplomatic corps because he had the longest service as ambassador in Washington. So that's the most prestigious within the diplomatic circle. Being the dean of the diplomatic corps in a country is super prestigious. So this was the Russian ambassador in the times of, let's say, McKinley and that kind of late 19th century. So we, with respect to Russia, we've had excellent, good relations with Russia ever since the American Revolution. We only had a difficult period with Russia from roughly 1917 and the revolution there to 1933. And then in 1933, President Roosevelt, made the gesture to restore diplomatic relations with Russia, which was, of course, the right thing to do and an excellent thing to do. So really, when you look at U.S.-Russia relations, we only had tension 1917 to 1933 at less than 20 years, 2 decades. And then we were allies in World War II, etc., a Cold War. But Eisenhower was always a friend of Zhukov, General Zhukov, Marshal Zhukov. So we kept it fairly contained. In the Cuban Missile Crisis, it was contained and so on by Jack Kennedy. So
I think we've also had important good relations with China. And today, I think as we're getting to the point where we need to wrap up, these questions of the identity of the United States, I think, are really important right now. because this British liberal colonial crazy system is clearly dead. If you try to revive it with bizarre religious cults like what we were discussing, you're going to collapse civilization or have World War III or have an economic collapse or something. I think, and this is for a whole other topic, but the cryptocurrency, this is like a religious belief, like the green stuff is. These are all kinds of bizarre religious cults that are not founded in reason. And I think if we restore good relations and we think of projects that will move mankind forward, one of the things I think is very urgent, even though the asteroid that they said had a 3% chance of hitting us 7 years from now it's only a 0.2% chance after they observed it more. We only know of 40% of the asteroids that are of that magnitude that could destroy a city. Well, it seems to me that it would be a fruitful area of collaboration between the major spacefaring nations, that we actually find out where these asteroids are and make sure that we can stop them if they're supposed to hit us. Also, in this situation of Israel-Palestine peace, as I know you're familiar with LaRouche's Oasis plan for the region, and now Trump's forcing of the ceasefire process and making his completely absurd proposal, which was sort of a provocation, I think, that the U.S. would take over Gaza. You now have a plan from Egypt for the reconstruction. How will that actually work? How will it be enforced? Well, we know that China and Russia work together to create this development where the 14 different Palestinian factions came together and said they could form a unity government. I think China is able to do that because they can build a 57-story building in a week. In other words, they can deliver. It's if China's involved in the reconstruction of this region, it is not going to take 300 years to remove all the rubble and that kind of. So there's a benefit. And I think doing these concrete, real things in the physical world, you can't build infrastructure based on mysticism or arbitrary beliefs. You have to have a connection with reality. So there's two things, I guess I'm saying. One is that if we have a real peace plan, which must of necessity involve the economic reconstruction and development of the region, that's going to change the culture, actually. But I think you can only do that if you have the major powers on the same page, because who is going to enforce that there is no fighting, that there are no breaches, and that you can guarantee the security of an Israeli state and a Palestinian state. So maybe to wrap up, if you could share your thoughts on that.
Well, sure. You put it really well. The core of what you're saying, I completely agree with, is that we have to have cooperation between the great powers, or the major powers, however you want to describe the United States, Russia, China. We can put India in there if we wish. But the idea of a concert of Europe in the 19th century, although it was for conservative purposes, but the idea of great powers not fighting each other, but working together to stabilize international politics, a political situation, and to cooperate. So I think my parting thought would be just to follow up and emphasize my support for what you just said. We must have a diplomacy that involves the major powers, ourselves, Russia, China, and the three of us, or with others too joining us, can, I'm not going to use the strong word impose, but can foster in a firm way peace and development in the Middle East. The last thing I'm going to point out is who is trying to disrupt U.S.-China relations, U.S.-Russia relations, and why. If you notice in American politics, the most fanatic people are the neoconservatives who want to destroy U.S.-Russia relations and U.S.-China relations. Why? So because they are revisionist Zionists, they want to prevent the US, Russia, and China from working together for peace and development in the Middle East. So while we're talking about the ideal of great power cooperation, we need to keep our eyes, particularly here in the United States, on, well, just who is it that's trying to interfere and block US-China relations or block US-Russia relations. So for those of us that are fighting for peace, we need to promote major power cooperation and not confrontation.
Yes, and I think abroad it's becoming more and more clear the British are playing a dreadful role.
Huge.
Yeah, and the
Back to
French.
Palmerston. They're Palmerston. That's what the great game. I mean, they were anti the Russian Empire back in the 19th century. They're just doing the same thing right now. The Crimean War, et cetera, et cetera. So absolutely, it's British imperialism, and certain circles in the United States think, particularly those who are sort of on the snobbish side, they think, well, we'll rub elbows with the British, and pip pip, we can follow the British lead, and that kind of stuff, the high society stuff.
Yeah, exactly. So could you please show your book again and tell people something about it, where they can get it?
Sure. My book is available on Amazon. So just make sure you get Dark Crusade with this cover, because there's an older edition which doesn't have the newest 3 or 4 chapters in it. So Dark Crusade, and it's called The Israel Lobby and Christian Zionism. And it's published by Commonwealth House Publishers in Charlottesville, Virginia. So if you just use Dark Crusade Commonwealth on a Google, that'll take you to the actual publisher's website, and you can buy it straight from the publisher here in Virginia, in Charlottesville. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Yes, thank you very much. So I just have a couple things to say in closing here. One is that the Schiller Institute will be having a major international conference in the New York metropolitan area on Memorial Day weekend, May 24th and 25th. You are invited to attend. Please visit the Schiller Institute website, schillerinstitute.com, for that. Otherwise, please like, share, subscribe the LaRouche Organization channel, and share on social media, and donate. If you sign up as a monthly donor to the LaRouche Organization, you will receive the LaRouche Daily Intelligence Review, Executive Intelligence Review Daily Alert, and the weekly publication. So thank you, everyone, for watching, and please be in touch, and please join our activities.